It's good to be with you today to share with you some ideas about the design and development of an assessment system, which is part of the first part of three workshops. Today we're looking at the development of an assessment system. So we're looking at if you like, the framework within which our assessment processes sit. Next time we meet, which will be the 9th of April, we'll be looking at the design and development and of assessment tools, the devices that we're going to use to actually observe the knowledge and skills of our learners. And in the final session, which is later this year, we'll be looking, or later this half year, we'll be looking at the interpretation of the assessment evidence in terms of making assessment decisions, assessment validation, and related issues. So think of this as the first of three parts. So there'll be some questions unanswered today because we will be referring those on, if you like, to later sessions. Our focus, though, on an assessment system reflects the fact that we need to make sure that our assessment processes are coherent, are planned, because we need to make sure that we can, through those processes, make wise decisions about a person's competency status. So it's a very important part of the preliminary thinking, if you like, about the assessment processes. When we think about an assessment system, we though need to think about, so wrong button, I'm sorry about that. We need to think about what an assessment system is. And if we look at what an assessment system is, and I'm just mucking about here with the buttons, it's a coordinated set of documented policies and procedures, and this is the definition taken from the standards for RTOs, your favourite document, and it basically describes a coordinated set of documented policies and procedures, which include the assessment materials and tools, which are our focus next time we meet, that ensure assessment is consistent and are based on the principles of assessment contained in Table 1.81 and the rules of evidence contained in Table 1.82. Now, we'll refer to those tables and to the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence a little bit later on. But what I want to focus on just here is the fact that it's documented. So you do need to have a documented process. This is not meant to be a haphazard sort of process. And it needs to be a coordinated process, one where we make sure that there is harmony and consistency between the various components. And we need to make sure that we end up with policies and procedures. So in the workshop, we are going to look at some aspects of documentation, and we're going to look at policies and procedures that together make up our assessment system. But we do need to make sure that we have a good assessment system, because at the end of the day, what we do when we're conducting assessment is carrying out not only a core business of an RTO, but we're also making profound judgments and decisions that can impact on our learners, our students' whole lives. So if we declare a person to be competent, then we are saying this person is workplace ready in relation to the application of that competency, and that has an impact on their own careers and their futures. It has an impact on their employers. It has an impact on the clients of those employers, and it has an impact on the community within which that system works. So we are making a profound judgment when we say that a person is competent. A profound judgment that has to be right all the way through. Now, we have a number of ways of trying to make sure that that works well. The first thing is that we're not just marking a student out of 100 and saying that 50% is a pass, where there are really no standards defined at all. We have real standards called competencies. Admittedly, they are still a work in progress. After many years, we're still getting better at defining what competencies are and defining competency standards. But nonetheless, in the vet sector, we have these competencies, and they're industry relevant competencies. They're derived from an understanding of what happens within industry. So we have those industry relevant competencies, and we are certificating that a person, an individual person, has achieved those, and that's what we're trying to do. To do that, to make that judgment, we need to make sure that we are all qualified assessors, and that there are, and we'll be touching on this today as well, a set of critical criteria for a person to be accepted as a qualified assessor, so that we make sure that the person making the judgment is well prepared to make that judgment. The judgment they make must be valid, reliable, fair and flexible, and these are the principles of assessment, and we'll come back to these principles a bit later on. But what we see here are standards for making good judgments. And the judgment itself must be based on evidence. So we are an evidence-based approach, and there are rules and standards for what is acceptable as evidence, and that evidence must be valid, sufficient, current and authentic. And they're the rules of evidence, and again we'll touch on those later on. But if we have all of these things operating together, that is evidence that meets the rules of evidence, feeding judgments that meet the principles of assessment, a judgment that is made by a qualified assessor against nationally recognised industry relevant competencies, then we can make sound, meaningful judgments and decisions, and that when we certificate a person, that certification has meaning. But that also carries, that's a positive side of it, but it also carries with it the fact that RTOs and assessors are accountable for the accuracy of these judgments. Because we have all of these components working together as part of our assessment process, then we are also now become accountable for the judgments we make. If we were in a different sector where we were saying the person was 50% and therefore a pass, we're not actually making a statement that has any particular kind of precision or meaning, and therefore there isn't kind of accountability. But when we make a judgment in the vet sector, we're accountable for those judgments, and that accountability can have implications in terms of litigation. And that does mean that we need to pay attention seriously to our assessment system, our policies and procedures, our documented processes, and later on in other workshops, the tools that we develop and design, and the way we use those tools and the way we make decisions with those tools, which is the third workshop, becomes really critically important. So we can see that in the vet sector, we're working in a different environment. The word assessment in our sector has a very precise meaning, and there are very significant conditions and arrangements that surround that meaning, which enable us to invest in our judgments a great deal of credibility. But all of that is really nice to say, but it's a little bit disconcerting to see that in recent evidence of reviews that TAC has done, where organisations have non-compliances, 36% of non-compliances relate to standard 1.8, which is assessment. And about 17%, not a further 17%, because it could overlap with the other, but 17% relate to assessment validation. So what we see here is a very significant level of non-compliance relating to assessment. And that is quite disconcerting when you consider this slide and the significance of the assessment process. So we've put together this series of 3 workshops, and in today's workshop we're going to look at policies and procedures and assessments, strategies and systems, and we have a series of components that we want to share with you. First of all, there is a pre-reading document that you've been sent in advance. Hopefully you've had a chance to go through that. I will take you very, very quickly through it, but we won't dwell on any particular issue. Just walk you through. So we are going to deal with that. We put it in red text on this slide because we want to make clear that this is something that, in a sense, is prior to the workshop. What we want to move on quickly into is influences on assessment choices. because when we start thinking about our assessment processes, we need to understand that we're not told how to assess, we're told what to assess in terms of the unit of competency, but we're not told how to assess. And that means we need to make choices, and we need to consider what are the key factors in the choices that we make when we come to developing our assessment strategies. And that's part of developing assessment systems and the like. We also need to think about planning assessment systems and strategies. How do we pre-plan, if you like, the processes that we're going to use? Then we need to look at documenting the assessment system, and finally validating the assessment system. And so they're the headings for today. As we go through this workshop, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box, and Mel will be mustering those questions. I, from time to time, will look at it, and Mel might start waving her hands because there's a really significant question that I need to pay attention to. But please put your questions forward, and from time to time we'll hesitate and make sure that questions are processed. And we will have a couple of breaks. The first break will be about 10 o'clock, and the second break will be about 11 o'clock, roughly speaking. And that will also give me time to have a look at questions that have accumulated and make sure that when we rejoin after those breaks that we can deal with those questions as we go. The final slide does provide you with tax contacts. And so if you have questions that you want us to respond to after the workshop, and quite often workshops do produce a kind of collection of questions that come to you on reflection, then you can direct your questions to TAC, and TAC will then either pass them on to me or be able to provide you with some response as we go. So we are working, of course, in a very distant, arm's length sort of way, but I do want you to feel comfortable about asking questions as we go, and we'll do our best in these circumstances to respond to them in a timely way. If we look at first at the pre-reading, and this is defined as a quick review of mandatory assessment requirements, we need to understand that what we're dealing with when it comes to assessment are three absolutes that are not negotiable. And these are critical if we are going to make sure we have credible decisions that are made about a person's competency. The first, of course, is units of competency. And if you look at your readings on page 2, you'll see that there is a definition of competency which is taken from the standards for RTOs. And the definition says, competency means a consistent application of knowledge and skill to the standard of performance required in the workplace. It embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. And that says a great deal about assessment and about the assessment systems and strategies that we need to put in place. For a start, it says consistent application. So assessment isn't going to be just knowing about the skill. We need to see the skill actually applied. And we don't need to see it just once, we need to see it more than once. Otherwise, how can we judge if we've seen consistency? And we are measuring different qualities. One is knowledge and another is skill. The two work in harmony, of course. It's going to be knowledge about the skill, and the skill is going to be informed by the knowledge that the person brings to the task. But this knowledge and skill, again, isn't, dare I use the phrase, just academic. It's got to be skills and knowledge that relate to productive outcomes in the workplace. So we need to meet, that means as observers, as assessors, building the system and the processes, we need to be workplace aware. And that comes under the general heading of current industry skills, which you're required to have. And we'll touch again on that a bit later on. Then it talks about transfer to new situations and new and different environments. And basically what that's saying again is that it's not adequate just to have a competency that a person learns and can repeat within a particular context. We don't know where they're going to work in the future, and we don't know what work in the future will look like. So we want these competencies to be transferable qualities, and that has a lot to say about assessment as well, because it does mean that our assessments need to be innovative, flexible and reflective not only of one context but a number of contexts, so that we can see that transfer has been demonstrated, and that means that the person we judge to be competent will not be just competent in the context within which we taught, but competent within workplaces that are yet unknown. And those are critical things. So you see in the definition of a unit of competency, you see straight away that it has a lot to say about what we're going to need to do in terms of our assessment systems, our assessment tools, and later on in the third workshop, our assessment judgments. The page 3 talks about the unit of competency and its structure. And all I really want to stress here is, and I'll draw this, I think, as on the whiteboard, if I may, is that the concept of competency is that fundamentally a unit of competency is a kind of target. And I'll draw it like this as a target. And that target could be up high for a high-level unit of competency, or it could be down low as a low level. It is fixed in space, though. It doesn't move around depending on the cohort of students you're teaching. The competency, which relates to the workplace, is dependent on what the workplace requires, not on the course that the student is doing. So we need to understand that a competency has a fixed level of sophistication. In the past, that's been designated by an AQF level, and indeed some training packages, such as BSB, still uses an AQF code to designate the level of sophistication of the unit of competency. The unit of competency is defined and pinned in place by a set of components called elements of competency, which in effect define what that competency means. And in order to measure those elements, each one of them is given a set of performance criteria, which are the performance aspects of the element that enables us to know the element has been seen. If we see those performance characteristics together, we have seen the element. If we see those performance characteristics separately, we haven't seen the element. And if we see some of the performance aspects and not others, we haven't seen the element. It basically tells us, from an assessment perspective, what it is we have to be looking for when we measure that element. So each element has a set of performance criteria. We're not actually measuring the performance criteria. What we're doing is saying, when I've seen those performance criteria, I have seen the element. So I'm actually measuring the element. And the whole thing is boxed with some additional information, such as knowledge evidence. And knowledge evidence is the knowledge that we need to make sure the student has acquired in order to be able to work effectively with the skills. And we'll come back to that issue later on when we look in the second workshop, when we look at assessment of knowledge. And there's performance evidence, which defines to some extent what kind of performance requirements are associated with the performance of these elements and this knowledge. And there's also, within the unit of competency, there are assessment conditions. For some reason unknown to man, this information is broken up into two documents, but you must always deal with both documents. So you must deal with the one document, which has the application, elements of competency, performance criteria, of course, maybe some foundation skills and other information. That's one document, and the other document contains the knowledge evidence, the performance evidence, and the assessment conditions. And neither document can be treated in isolation. They must always be worked with together. So that is discussed on page 2, page 3 of your pre-reading handout, and page 4 as well. So it's really you need to get your head around that, because at the end of the day, our assessment systems and processes are going to service the assessment of those qualities. When it comes to training, of course, we're talking not just about the target, but we're talking about the pathway, and different students will have different pathways to that competency. Some students don't need to actually follow a pathway to the competency at all. They're already there, and under those circumstances, we have recognition of prior learning. That is, we're basically saying there's nothing that you need to learn in order to get the competency. There's a pretty good chance, because of your workplace experiences and other experiences that you might have had, but you've got that competency already, and all we need to do then is assess it. So we have the assessment component here, which may follow training, or it may be an RPL process. And so assessment here is what we're focusing on in this series of workshops. We're not going to be addressing the pathway to it. That's a training strategy rather than an assessment strategy, and that's something that we can't deal with within the context of these workshops. But you can see critically that although there will be variation in pathways for different learners and different students and different circumstances, the unit of competency is a fixed attribute, and that means that there is a real standard within our context of assessment in the vet sector. Well, how do we know someone is competent? Well, what we are looking for, of course, is evidence. We go through a process when it comes to assessment of first of all, gathering evidence, evidence in relation to the components, and evidence that complies with the components of the unit of competency. And when all the evidence has been seen, we're in a position to make a judgment. And when all of the evidence has been demonstrates that the person's achieved all of these qualities, then they're competent. If they haven't achieved all of these qualities, then they're not yet competent, and we suspend our judgment, or we declare them not yet competent until such time as all the evidence is in. So we are an evidence-based process, and that's going to be very important when it comes to next session, when we start looking at the design of evidence gathering tools. So the process is a binary one. First we gather evidence, then we make judgments. But the evidence we gather must relate directly to these components, and the judgment we make must relate to these components. And in that way, we have a valid system. There's more to it than that, and then we'll come to those extra components a bit later on. Finally, we need to understand that, and looking at the last part I want to reflect on in terms of the pre-reading, is that what we do as from an assessment point of view is covered by standards for RTOs. This is our gospel, if you like. It provides for us a set of standards, and it does not tell us how to assess. It tells us what qualities must be reflected in our assessment processes and policies and procedures and so on. So fundamentally, this describes a set of outcomes rather than prescribing a particular process of assessment. That does leave you with a lot of choices then about what you're going to do here in terms of your assessment processes. And different trainers and assessors might have different strategies for assessment, all of which do meet the standards for RTOs and therefore are all legitimate, yet reflect the different contexts and situations within which the trainers and assessors are working. And we'll come back a bit to that later on when we look at our first activity, when we start looking at what are the impacts on the decisions we make about how we're going to assess these qualities. So you need to understand that the standards for RTOs do not prescribe exactly how things are to be done. It prescribes what standards must be met by our choices in terms of how we're going to do things. And in our pre-reading on page 5, it comes as a bit of a shock to realise that although the concept of assessment is primarily talked about in the glossary and then in standard 1.8, in actual fact there's almost every blooming clause in standard 1 and some of the clauses in other standards actually have a direct connection to assessment. And that simply reflects the fact that this assessment, as a function of an RTO, is really critical to its performance. So we have the standards for RTOs that speak great in volumes about assessment, and everything we share with you today will be consistent with the standards. We may go from time to time beyond the standards because we're going to provide you with some ideas and advice beyond the standards. And I'll try and make clear to you when I'm talking about something that is mandated by the standards or something that is advice. What we'll share with you is always has in the back of our minds the standards. To help you with the standards, there is a user guide. It's considerably thicker than the standards because it talks not just about the standards, which are already printed for you, but talks about the function and role and purpose of each clause in the standards. It talks about the way in which that clause relates to other clauses in the standards. It talks about the way in which you can operate with the clause in terms of the sorts of decisions you might make, and including the flexibility and variability that you have. And it also touches on what an auditor might look for as evidence of your compliance with the clause. So you'll find that the guide, which was recently updated, will assist you with the standards for RTOs. It's not sort of a book that you sit down and read, and not unless you need to go to sleep quickly. It's a document that you dig into and refer to when you're dealing with a particular issue. Then TAC provides a considerable number of fact sheets. Not surprisingly, there is a fact sheet on assessment, and this fact sheet on assessment does take you through not only the mandatory components of the standards, but also provides advice in terms of strategies that you might adopt to meet those requirements. There's a fact sheet on assessment validation. By the way, these are referred to on page 1 of your pre-reading, so you don't need to write these down. But there's a fact sheet on assessment validation, which is very much a topic for discussion in our third workshop. There's a fact sheet on the recognition of prior learning, because standard 1.8, which relates to assessment, specifically refers to recognition of prior learning as an assessment process, and indeed our assessment systems need to take into consideration the requirements of that. There's a fact sheet on online and distance training and assessment, and that is a process that actually challenges us when it comes to assessment. Because we are evidence-based, we need to make sure that the evidence we're gathering is authentic and relevant. There is a fact sheet on records management, and we'll be talking about records management today. And we'll be talking, and there is a fact sheet on RTO complaints and appeals, or for that matter, even complaints might relate to assessment. There's a fact sheet on industry engagement, and that basically reflects the fact that we need, because we're assessing these industry relevant units of competency, we need to engage with industry to know what industry is asking for, and that is then reflected both in our vocational competence and our industry currency, which is another fact sheet from TAC. Those are the key ones, but there are others, one relating to quality, another relating to meeting and identifying learner needs, and another related to amount of training, although whether you incorporate assessment as part of the amount of training or not is up to you. And then there are third-party arrangements, because it could be that a third party is conducting assessments on your behalf, in which case you need to look at third-party arrangements as well. So you can see that, and there are many more which I'm not going to take you through now, but you can see that TAC has gone to a great deal of trouble to, as part of its commitment to education and support for RTOs, to provide you with guidance and advice, sometimes direction, because it may be referring to the standards, and so that you can support you through the processes of this exercise. Now, Alvin has asked a question, which is, he is an automotive trainer and assessor, and he asks, on the assessment itself, there is a student guide for practical assessment. What do I need to do if allowed time is too long for each student, but they just need to stay for 8 hours for practical assessment? I've got 30 students. I have to say, Alvin, that you are dealing there with a tricky issue. So fundamentally, it may not necessarily mean that there's 8 hours of your continuous time by 30 students, which is a very substantial body of your time. But it may be that the assessment process requires them to be immersed in a process for 8 hours. I really would need to spend a bit of time talking with you about what this particular issue is. We also do a challenge quite often with units of competency, where the writers of the units of competency somehow or other imagine that you have an infinite amount of time to conduct assessments. And so one of the things that we need to do is to be a little bit cunning and a little bit strategic in our processes, We'll be touching a bit more on that next time we meet, because that's looking at the actual assessment tools and how you devise your assessment tools so you can gather the maximum amount of evidence in the minimum amount of time. And it also relates to judgment, which is our third workshop, because we'll be asking the question, well, you know, where can you get the evidence from to make a judgment? And are there other ways in which you can gather evidence, such as from co-assessments with other units through some sort of clustering process? So the issue of time is a significant challenge. We can't cut our assessments short, because if we do so, we are likely to make wrong judgments, and that could be tragic. So we are going to have to be cunning and clever in the way in which we utilise our time and the students' time to be able to get the evidence we need. So I think it's something we probably will need to come back to next time we meet, when we start looking at the strategies for assessment, the actual assessment tools and the like. Today we can only really deal with the framework within which we're working, so that we understand, well, whatever we do, these are the benchmarks and these are the requirements with which we must fit. And that does take us naturally to the primary clause in the standards which relate to assessment, and it's the only one that specifically relates to assessment, but as I've indicated to you before, many other clauses in the standards have a kind of tangential connection to assessment. And basically it says you must implement an assessment system, which again is stressing that it's not haphazard, it's a process thought through, planned and documented, that ensures that assessment, and notice now it says including recognition of prior learning, because this is a reminder that recognition of prior learning is not some sort of chat over a cup of coffee about whether a person thinks they are or are not competent. It's a formal assessment process, and it must do two things. It must first comply with the assessment requirements of the relevant training package or VET accredited course. And in some older training packages, there were assessment guidelines. In the modern training packages with the streamlined units of competency, this information, the assessment requirements, is embedded in that second document, which looks at knowledge evidence, performance evidence, and assessment conditions. But the second part of it says it must be conducted in accordance with the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. So we need to pause a bit and have a look at what these things say, because our assessment system that we devise must be designed to make sure that these things happen. And the first thing is, in terms of judgments, that we must have a system which promotes fairness. That is, it is responsive to the individual's needs and understands the circumstances under which students are learning, and can adjust for that, such as making sure students are aware of and fully informed about how they're going to be assessed. And we need to know about any kinds of, for example, reasonable adjustments that we might need to make in order to be able to accommodate a student who presents with a disability, to make sure that our assessments are fair and reflect the person's real competence and is not interfered with, if you like, because we've been insensitive to their disability. And to do all of that, we need to be flexible. That is, we need to be able to cope with the fact that this competency here, both in the workplace and in the learning environment, can be demonstrated in different ways. And we need to be able to respond to that in a way which enables individuals to demonstrate their true competence. Throughout the fairness and flexibility, we must never lose sight of validity. That is, what we're assessing must be what is required in the unit of competency. We can't be so fair and so flexible that we're now not measuring the actual unit of competency. That would invalidate the whole process. And we must do all of these things in a way which is consistent and replicable and in effect reliable, so that we need to know that we are carrying through the processes in a way which leads to consistent results in terms of judgments of competency. Fairness, flexibility, validity and reliability are defined and illustrated in the actual standards themselves in the table where they're presented as part of Standard 1.8. The other thing is, of course, that those are all relate to judgments, but we also have to understand that these judgments are based on evidence, and that evidence itself must be, in the first instance, valid. That is, we must only gather evidence that relates to the unit of competency. Any other evidence we gather, well, we could gather other evidence, but we need to look away from that evidence when we're making the assessment judgment. So if we gather evidence about some other quality, we must be careful that that other quality doesn't interfere with our judgment of whether a person is or is not competent. So validity is partly the process of not paying attention to stuff that is irrelevant in relation to the unit. But it also comes down to, and primarily comes down to, making sure that every aspect of the unit of competency, the minutiae of that competency, are all evidence. We gather evidence on all of those qualities. So we can't afford to ignore a performance criterion. We can't afford to ignore an item of knowledge. We cannot, in a sense, customize our assessment processes. We can contextualize them. We can rephrase them and so on, but we mustn't change the meaning. And we must be able to say that with that we have ticked off every quality. So if I tick off these performance criteria, I can tick off the element. And when I have ticked off all the elements, I have seen the elements of competency. The knowledge evidence is made up of a list when each of those items of knowledge have been seen, and there are a set of performance evidence requirements, and when each of all of those have been seen, when all of them have been seen, then we can tick off the unit as being achieved, and not until all of those have been seen. So validity basically is saying we must look for everything that the unit requires, and we must look for everything in a valid way. For example, when we're measuring knowledge, we need to actually know that the person knows that information. We cannot presume that because they can perform the skill that they have the necessary knowledge. And likewise, a person who demonstrates knowledge may not have the skill. So we have to make sure that we use valid methods of assessment, and that again is something for us to talk about next time we meet. But what you can see here is the concept of validity is about excluding stuff that's not relevant, including everything that is relevant, and assessing things in the right way. So it's a big ask, but if we don't achieve those qualities, then the evidence is rubbish. And sometimes you see circumstances where people are finding it difficult to gather evidence, and they think, oh well, I'll just gather lots and lots of bad evidence and it'll somehow or other add up to good evidence. Sorry, it doesn't work like that. Valid evidence is very clearly defined by what is required by the unit of competency. And it's much better for us to have a small, sharply focused assessment process than a big, nebulous, badly focused assessment process. It's a bit like pixelation. We need the fine, high-definition image in order for us to know a person truly is competent. Otherwise, their competency is kind of pixelated and anonymous if we use a sort of very broad brush. So validity becomes really important. Sufficiency basically says, well, we need to be absolutely confident that the person is competent. And that means we are likely to need to assess on more than one occasion. And indeed, we need to assess on more than one occasion if we want to judge consistency and if we want to judge transfer. And both of those are part of the definition of what it is to be competent. So sufficiency is partly about certainty, and it's partly about transfer, and it's partly about consistency. Sufficiency, you can see, is important. What we don't want is a one-shot assessment where the person could fluke a quality of competency, and we would then be deluded into thinking they were competent when they were not. Authenticity says that when we're carrying out these assessments, we need to know absolutely that the person who's producing the evidence is the person who is enrolled, and it's not being done by some sort of surrogate or some sort of actor or a friend, that it is in fact actually evidence produced by that individual. That does create for us challenges when it comes to assessment online, because it's not difficult to fabricate or to create an illusion of competence online when we need to know that this is actually the student enrolled that we're observing. And currency basically says we need to reflect on the fact that they're competent now at the time we're assessing. And indeed that again says that old evidence from the past may reflect a person's past competence, but does it reflect their current competence? And the critical thing here is that when we certificate a person to be competent, we are saying at this date, at this time, when this statement of attainment or whatever is issued, the person had demonstrated competency. We're not saying that they're going to be competent for the rest of their lives. That may depend on them retaining the competency and practicing the competency and the like. What we need to be able to say is at the time we certificate, they are competent. So the evidence that upon which we base that call needs to be current evidence and not antique or ancient evidence that they've dredged up from the past. So you can see that these four requirements for evidence are quite demanding, and we are basically saying, of course, that our assessment system must create an environment where we get fair, flexible, valid and reliable judgments, and our assessment system and policies must create an environment where we are able to say that the evidence is valid, sufficient, authentic and current. And these apply to any form of assessment that we adopt, including, of course, recognition of prior learning. So these are critically important demands, and we need to take these very seriously. And they will underpin every one of our workshops, because this evidence requirements is very much a part of our next workshop, which looks at designing assessment tools. And the previous slide, which looks at assessment judgments, is very much going to be part of our third workshop. So you can see we're going to revisit these ideas again and again. So it's really good for you to get your head around these, internalize them, so that you know that that's where we're going. But right now we're focusing on how can we make sure these things work through the way in which to devise our assessment system. And a great deal of that comes down to who we have as assessors. And so we need to make sure that the people that are carrying out the process of assessment, initially in terms of the design of the assessment tools, keep in mind that most of the time you need to design your own assessment tools. But even if you purchase someone else's assessment tools, you need to validate those purchased assessment tools to make sure that they're good. And so as an assessor, you are either creating your own assessment tools or you are validating someone else's assessment tools, and that requires a special kind of expertise. And that expertise is reflected in clauses 113 to 120 in the standards. But just to summarise them, first of all, you need to have assessor skills from the TAE. That is planned assessment activities and processes, which is the part of the process of setting up an assessment, if you like. Assess competence, which looks specifically at the fact that in the vet sector we're competency-based, and how you go about interpreting competencies and assessing them. Participate in assessment validation, because under stat clauses 1.9 through 1.11, you may be called upon to participate in assessment validation. And keep in mind that even in clause 1.8, validity is a requirement both of the judgment and of the tools themselves. So you need to do your own validation initially when you're designing things. It's sometimes called pre-use validation. And then under standards 1.9 through 1.11, you need to participate in post-use validation. And sometimes that participation might be because you are part of the validation panel, validating someone else's assessment tools and assessment practices, or it might be you are the subject of validation, and a validation panel is validating you and your tools and your use of those tools and the judgments you make. So participating in assessment validation is an important part of, if you like, closing the story, because you design, develop, use and then validate is all part of the process. And then there's a 500 or a level unit from the diploma, design and develop assessment tools, which is now required of you to be able to go through the process of starting from a unit of competency and designing and developing assessment tools. And of course, that's very much a part of our discussion next time we meet. But on the right-hand side are three very key components, and these come from clause 113A, B, and C. 113A says you must be vocationally competent, which either means you have the unit of competency yourself, that you are this unit, that you are teaching and assessing, or you have an equivalent unit to it, which is something which you may have acquired in the past and is declared to be equivalent, or you might need to be able to show that you have equivalent competence through an analysis of your previous training experiences, your professional development, and workplace activities and the like. And so the vocational competency, it doesn't say you have to have the unit, it says you have to have the vocational competency of the unit, which can be demonstrated in one of three ways, and that's having the unit, having an equivalent unit, or being able to establish on an item by item basis that you actually would have the unit should you be assessed. And that's part of, that will appear in your training and assessment competency matrix or whatever you use, and be evidence-based. Again, you need to be able to show that you have the competency that you're assessing. And that, of course, means that when you read the unit of competency, you understand what the words mean, you understand what the competency requires. It also helps, of course, that if you've got the competency that you can actually teach that unit of competency, but we're focused today on assessment. The second thing is that you're industry skilled, and what that is saying is that you need to understand this competency beyond itself. You need to understand how this competency relates to other competencies that the learner might be acquiring as part of a qualification or a skill set. You need to understand how this unit of competency relates to the workplace to lead to productive and meaningful outcomes in the workplace, because all these units of competency have the original derivation and meaning from the workplace. So you need to understand that. And you need to understand how this unit of competency therefore might connect with and relate to competencies of other people in the workplace, including clients. That means that you need to be immersed in industry. And so if clauses 1.5 and 1.6 talk about industry engagement, and what it's basically saying is, well, yes, you might have started off in industry, and indeed we expect you did. But are you still part of that industry? Are you still immersed in that industry? Are you still engaged with that industry? So that as the competencies change and evolve, and as industry changes and evolves, are you keeping up to date with that? That means that in terms of your teaching, you'll be able to reflect what happens in industry. But from our point of view today, in your assessment, you'll be able to reflect what happens in industry. And that's important because the judgment you're making is that the person is industry ready. And if you don't know what industry is doing now these days, how can you judge that a person is industry ready? So it really is important that you be industry skilled. Indeed, the actual words are current industry skills. The word current is critical in there because it's not adequate just to have some past history in the industry. You need to be up to date with what's going on now. And then there are VET skills and knowledge. And basically what we understand on the left-hand side of this slide, you have assessor skills, but those were things you learnt some time ago. Are you retaining your expertise? And participation in workshops like this hopefully will help you with that, keeping your VET skills and knowledge up to date. But of course, immersion in the VET environment, be it a large organisation like a TAFE or a smaller RTO, is part of contextualising what your understandings from your training to the VET environment. And so you need to keep those skills and knowledge up to date. I might say, by the way, that there are other clauses. So 114 and 115 relate to the assessor skills on the left. 116 relates to professional development, through which all of these things need to be kept up to date. And 117 through 120 relate to people who are not yet fully qualified, but perhaps bring along the vocational competence and the industry skills, but need to acquire the assessor skills and VET skills and knowledge. And it talks about, those clauses talk about how those people need to be supervised. But critically and interestingly, if you look at 117, it says that if you don't have all of these qualities, you cannot make an assessment judgment. You can participate in the assessment process, but you cannot make the assessment judgment. And so what you see from that clause is a reminder that to make this critically important thing called an assessment judgment, you need to have the full collection of qualities that are described in this slide. And that is one of the things that enables us to say that the judgments we make and the certificates we issue as RTOs have credibility beyond just the campus. They have credibility beyond. I might say one of the lovely things about VET, perhaps versus higher education, is that in higher education we tend to say when a person passes is that they've completed a body of learning and have passed. When we make a declaration at the end of VET, we are not just saying they've completed a body of learning and have passed, but we're also saying, and now they're ready for the future. We are future oriented because these competencies are the competencies that they carry into the workplace for their careers, their future careers, or maybe for future learning as well. And that orientation that we have of being future oriented, we're not just reflecting on what a person has done in the past, we're now reflecting on what a person can do in the future. And that puts us in a profoundly different position than in other sectors. If we then move on, we can see that this quality of assessors, those characteristics, means that the assessor has a particular kind of role. And if you look at this slide on the left-hand side, we can see the assessor developing the assessment mapping, which we will talk about next time, designing assessment tools, again, which we'll talk about next time, and managing the evidence gathering process, which we'll be looking at in our third workshop. And the assessor also, on the right-hand side, collates the evidence, makes the assessment judgment, reports the assessment outcomes, and participates in assessment validation. And again, that's what we're dealing with in our third workshop. But there is a role between the designer and the decision maker, and that is the evidence gatherer. And the evidence gatherer might well be an assessor, it could well be you, but you can employ the services of other people, such as tutors or supervisors or colleagues, who can act as evidence gatherers under your management. So when it says under the assessor that you manage the evidence gathering process, what it's saying is that if you're using people other than yourself to gather evidence, then you need to manage them. And so that the evidence gatherer gathers the evidence, reports to the assessor, and participates in assessment validation. So you can see these three different roles. The bookends, if you like, the development and the decision making must be done by someone who has all the qualities of an assessor. The person sitting in the middle does not need to utilize all of those qualities. They are the evidence gatherer. And we're going to be looking at evidence gathering next time we meet. So what we're saying, though, is that when we come to developing our assessment system and our assessment policies, we need to understand that we need to make sure that we have qualified assessors doing the development and the design and management. We need to make sure that we have qualified assessors in our policies and procedures who collect the evidence, and by that I mean collate the evidence, makes the assessment judgments, reports and validates. But in our policies and procedures, we might also allow for another kind of person, an evidence gatherer. We sometimes call them third-party evidence gatherer, but I beg you not to call them third-party assessors because they're not assessing. They are simply gathering evidence. And we need to make sure our policies and procedures accommodate that kind of role. So what we're going to do is when we come to building our assessment processes, particularly when we're developing our assessment tools, is we need to consider all sorts of things in terms of what's going to be appropriate to the assessment strategy we're going to use. Obviously, we start from the unit of competency, and we'll be doing that next time we meet. So we need to start with the unit of competency. But then we need to ask ourselves the question, well, what are the circumstances within which we're working? The assessment process here is going to be something that you develop yourselves. And so you need to consider the sort of influences. I've done it again, I've pressed the wrong button. I've got to do work on my competencies, don't I? But we need to consider the sort of aspects that will affect the way in which we assess. And there are three things that you might consider, and in a moment I'm going to ask you to look at Activity 1, but if you have Activity 1 sheet printed out, you'll see that we have asked you to think about the influences on assessment system decisions. And the first one, if we flip the page on Activity 1, is industry relevance. And here we're talking about the relevance of the unit of competency to industry. So the first item is the range of applications of the competency in workplaces. How is the competency used to achieve productive outcomes? So we need to understand the unit not just on itself, not just in sort of the abstract as it's printed in the training package, but we need to look at that application section, which is part of that first document, and we need to draw on our industry skills to think about, well, what does this mean, this unit mean in terms of industry? Where is this unit of competency used? What range of industries is involved? What are national and local industry expectations? And are there any regulatory requirements? So I'm going to ask you to give some thought to completing the table on page 2 of Activity 1. Oh, thank you very much, Mel. She's really spot on here with all this information. And you can see that that's an activity which we'll want you to think about. On page 3, I'm challenging Mel. Next page, Mel. Oh, you've done it. Oh, terrific. Is resources. RTO resources will impact on how you assess. For example, what facilities do you have? Do you have workshops? Do you have suitable classrooms? What facilities do you have available? What equipment and materials do you have available? What evidence gathering processes and tools can you legitimately call on? Do you have candidate support services? Can you call on local industry work sites and personnel? What trainers do you have? And assessors do you have? All of those things could impact on how you decide to assess. And the final thing that we want you to reflect on, thanks Mel, is candidate characteristics. And this is really important indeed. There is a fact sheet on responding to individual needs, but things like language literacy and numeracy could impact on how you assess. A student who presents with one or more disabilities will also affect how you assess. And you also have to think about whether the person is currently in employment and can you exploit that circumstance as an assessment context. You may need to think about previous experience and or training. Does that change how you assess? You need to think about where they're located. Are they in a rural environment? Dare I say it, are they in prison? Where are they located? And can that affect your choices? And access to technology, because it may be that we can utilize technology, innovative technologies, as part of our assessment process. So what I'd like you to do over the next, and I'm going to say 15 minutes because I'm going to ask you to give 5 minutes to these and then take a 10-minute break. And indeed, I think the next slide indicates to you that we are going to take a break. And we've miraculously happened to hit the right time. Don't know how that happened. But we basically want you to reflect on how you would find out about the impact, be it a candidate characteristic. How would you find out if they had a disability? How would you find out if they had language literacy and numeracy issues? How would you find out what industry requirements were? Those sorts of things. How that knowledge could then impact on assessments. What sort of impact will that awareness have on the choices you make for assessing the unit of competency? How you could evaluate the impact. I mean, is it a positive impact or a negative impact? Is it constructive or is it harmful? And then how you can design your assessment to work in cahoots with that impact, either to avoid some of the negative impacts and enhance the opportunity and of good quality choices. And I do need to stress to you here at this point that some of these things are going to be challenging. There will be circumstances, for example, where a person presents with a disability that simply cannot be accommodated within the context of the competency, that there's no way that that person with that disability will be able to handle this competency without you invalidating the competency by turning away from a particular aspect. And so there are going to be boundaries, there are going to be limitations. We cannot be all things to all people. But what we need to do is to try to make sure that there isn't inadvertent or inappropriate response. That means that the person with the disability, it might be possible for them to demonstrate all these qualities if we are wise and careful and make reasonable adjustments. So there are challenges in this thing, and it is possible to get it wrong. It's really important that we get it right. So I'm going to ask you to give some thought to that now. I make it just past 10 o'clock. If we could reconvene at, I would say, I'm going to say 20 past because I want a 10-minute break and 10 minutes on the activity. If we could reconvene at 20 past, which is just a reasonable amount of time, I think, and if you could share your ideas through Mel, through the chat pages, we can have a look at some of your feedback and respond to it. And then we'll move on to the planning of our assessment systems and strategies. Alvin has asked a question, what if the assessors only have the certificate 4 on TAE but doesn't have industry skills? If they don't have industry skills, they cannot be an assessor. However, they can be part of an assessor team. So what would happen is that, and you'll find that it says in the standards and I'll see if I can, it says here, industry experts may also be involved in the assessment judgment, working alongside a trainer and or assessor to conduct the assessment. So what we have is a circumstance that is repeated twice in these standards, where it makes it clear that a person who doesn't have the industry skills can work collaboratively with someone who does, so that together have the industry skills. Now, if we go back to that earlier slide, which I won't do now, but you remember on the left-hand side was an assessor and on the right-hand side was an assessor. One doing the person doing the planning, then the same person probably then making the judgments. If we were working in the kind of circumstance that Alvin has referred to here, thank you very much, Mel, that the word the assessor on the left and the assessor on the right could be a collaborative team of a person who brings the TAE expertise and someone else who brings the industry skills. It actually specifically allows us to do that within the standards. And likewise, when it comes to making the judgment has to be made as a shared judgment between a person who has TAE skills. And so when it comes to the design, the person is saying, the TAE person is saying, I'm bringing to the relationship or the partnership my expertise on assessment, and the industry person says, I'm bringing to the design process my expertise in industry, and together they can develop a good assessment tools. But then they both have to cooperate in the judgment at the end. You can't just have one or other doing that, because the person who's TAE trained can look back and say, this evidence is being gathered according to the VET standards and the RTO standards, and proper processes have been followed, and the industry expert can say, and this evidence, which we now know is good evidence, does demonstrate that this person has achieved the industry qualities of the unit of competency. So you can see that the words the assessor could be an individual who has all of these qualities, or a partnership where those qualities are brought together. Okay, I've eroded your time a little bit, but let's still meet again in 15 minutes at 20:10. Let's take a break. Could you now have a look while we're taking this break at activity 1? And we'll reconvene to see your comments on that at 20 past. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you after that little bit of a break. I hope you had a chance to go outside and photosynthesize, or a cup of coffee, or just take a little bit of time for yourselves. But also, I hope you've had a chance to look at the activity 1. this is an activity which you perhaps might want to spend a bit of time with after the workshop today. But here's a response from one of our participants. I won't name the person because I'm not too sure that we asked for permission to do so. But this person has reflected on candidate characteristics, and you can see that there's a consideration of how you would find out about it. And so, for example, with language literacy and numeracy, the suggestion is we look at prior knowledge, education level achieved, and prior testing, so that you can learn about a person's language literacy and numeracy issues from previous training that they've done with you, or then you can look at the education level achieved, or you might do some LLN assessment when they enroll. So that is part of the way you can find out about it. And then it could impact on your assessment processes. They might not be at the required level for assessment and may not achieve. Now, of course, the situation is that you need to look at the unit of competency itself and say, does this unit of competency require sophisticated language literacy or numeracy? And if it doesn't, then you need to make sure that the assessment strategies you've created don't introduce that. So, for example, if the actual unit of competency does require a lot of reading, then you need to make sure your assessment does not involve a lot of reading. And it could be done orally rather than in writing. On the other hand, if there's a substantial literacy, language, and numeracy requirement implicit in the unit, then it is quite appropriate for you to make sure that the assessment involves that language literacy and numeracy requirement. So that the suggestion here is that you need to make sure that the assessments are at the required AQF level, keeping in mind, though, that we don't always know the AQF level of a unit, so we need to read the unit of competency and understand the level of sophistication that the unit involves. And there could be and this could be part of a pre-assessment validation. So you can see the sort of thinking that's going on. Again, with disability, the student may in fact have indicated a disability within the context of their enrolment. I might say, by the way, under the Disability Discrimination Act, that if they've declared a disability, then you must put in writing how you're going to accommodate that disability within the context of the units of competency the person's undertaking. In other words, you must consider whether or not the units can be delivered, and we're talking here about reasonable adjustment. Notice the emphasis on the word reasonable. So a reasonable adjustment would mean that we can accommodate that person's disability in a way which is reasonable. It's not going to be too expensive. It's going to be consistent with what happens in the workplace. It's not going to invalidate the unit of competency. It's not going to harm other students. It's not going to send the RTO broke. So reasonableness kicks in. And if the disability is such that the person cannot possibly achieve the unit of competency through some form of reasonable adjustment, then you must, under the law of the Disability Discrimination Act, you must by law notify the student in writing that they can't undertake that unit and why they can't undertake that unit. So when it comes to something like disability, we're not talking about just being casual in our response. There is a very formal set of requirements laid down under law. So you might find out about their current employment through an interview or questionnaire. We might work around the student's availability. It might be an aspect where we adjust our assessment processes and timing to fit in with their work schedule. But we might also say, well, if their work is relevant to the unit of competency, can we actually utilise that work environment as an assessment environment? And under those circumstances, we might use someone in the workplace as an observer. They're not an assessor, they're just helping us with the evidence gathering, and we would manage a process of evidence gathering in the workplace, so that we either may have to work around the workplace if it's not relevant, or we may actually utilise the workplace if it is relevant. And that's part of that story of being cunning and clever and thoughtful when it comes to assessment, so that we can utilise resources, some of which we manage, some of which we might access, such as a student's workplace, in order to be able to carry through our processes. So our systems, our strategies, our policies and procedures all need to give us that kind of room to move so that we can be flexible and fair and responsive and make best use of the resources we have available. So we'll now return to our presentation, but you can see in the thinking that's gone into the production of this table, and I appreciate the fact that that you've not had a lot of time to spend on it, but what it does do is remind us that we need in our assessment processes and systems to be able to be flexible and fair and take into consideration the resources that we have to hand. We're going to look now at planning, assessment systems and strategies. And if you turn in your pre-reading to page 7, you'll find this slide, which is possibly a bit hard for you to read on your screen. So we've taken the liberty of printing it here on page 7 of your pre-reading. And what we want to do is just to use this as a kind of structure for thinking about the sort of the planning decisions that you need to make you go through. And indeed, this is going to be the focus of our next few minutes in terms of thinking about where we're going. So it's worth a while turning to page 7 of your pre-reading. We start with the unit of competency. It always starts with the unit of competency, and indeed it'll end with the unit of competency, because we use the unit of competency as a starting point in terms of our planning, and we use the competency at the end in terms of making our assessment, judgment, and certification. So the unit of competency bookends, if you like, the whole process. And so it really is important that we understand what the unit of competency has to say. What are the mandatory requirements? And in particular, the elements of competency and their performance criteria, knowledge evidence and performance evidence. But don't forget that if there are foundation skills listed, they are mandatory requirements. And there might also be mandatory requirements in terms of assessment context, such as assessment in the workplace or the use of simulation specified in the assessment conditions. So what you need to do is examine the unit of competency. The phrase that most people use is unpack the unit of competency, get to know what's in it. I might say, by the way, that the other thing that people often jump over is the application of the unit. And the application of the unit actually tells you where the unit is going to be used in industry, in the workplace. And surprise, surprise, that is also telling you how you might assess, because you are going to be assessing the application of the unit. It is a part of the definition of the unit of competency is about the application of skills and knowledge. So we should look at the application section and say, this gives me some ideas about how I might set up an assessment strategy. So we start with the unit of competency, and you need to make sure that in your policies and procedures for your assessment systems and strategies that there is that careful analysis of the unit's requirements. Now, it's interesting that at that point, it's useful to do a little bit of a validation. Check with a colleague whether your perception of what matters in this unit is confirmed by their perception. And I'm going to suggest to you that at each of these steps, represented by a little arrow in this diagram, you can do a little validation, because you want to make sure that every step is carefully managed. Once you've identified what are the mandatory requirements, you can start looking at a mapping. And I do want to stress here that a mapping is not specified as a requirement in the standards. We're just suggesting to you that it's a very good idea. And most RTOs that I come across do have this sort of mapping process. And fundamentally what it's trying to do is to make sure that the evidence gathering tools, which is the third line, the third box, faithfully reflect the unit of competency, which is the first box. And so in between those two boxes is conveniently a mapping, which says here are the unit requirements and here are the evidence gathering tools, and this is how they relate. So it's normally a matrix showing that. And you can look at the matrix and you can look down a column and say, first, are all the unit requirements listed? If they're not, is fix it up so that they are all listed. Then we look across each line for each component, and we say, is evidence being gathered for each of these requirements? Where is this evidence being gathered for each of these requirements? And then you can look down the columns for each evidence gathering and tool and say, what is this tool measuring? What is this tool gathering evidence about? And you can see that by an analysis of that, you can get to understand how the process of gathering evidence relates to and is consistent with the requirements of the unit of competency. So this mapping process, whilst not mandated, nonetheless makes it possible to show that you are meeting the principles of assessment in terms of flexibility and fairness and validity, and you're meeting the rules of evidence in terms of validity and sufficiency. So you can see that the mapping is a useful device, albeit not mandated in the standards. So I'm describing it here as a critical step, as it provides the means to ensure that all unit requirements are identified and all are sufficiently and validly addressed through evidence gathering tools. Validly addressed means that we're measuring knowledge through question and answer. This is for next week, of course, next time we meet, of course, and we're measuring skills through actual performance. And so that's part of what is valid. And typically there would be a knowledge test, typically, and two observations, both tools relating to the practical tasks or the skills. And that doesn't mean that they have to be in silos. You could actually ask knowledge questions while a person is performing a practical test. I'm just saying typically that's how it would look. So again, you can get someone to validate that. Is the mapping valid? Have we dismembered or broken up any of the elements of competency so the performance criteria are not all being measured or not all being measured together? Those sorts of things are things that you can do. So you can see that the mapping can involve a little validation. Then we get to the evidence gathering tools. Now, what you get from the mapping is a kind of blueprint which says this is what the knowledge assessment is going to cover, this is what this practical assessment is going to cover, this is what this next practical assessment is going to cover, and you can see from that what is the function of each evidence gathering tool. And so fundamentally, you are now taking the unit requirements, bringing to bear your industry skills and knowledge and your vocational competencies, and imagining and devising a set of activities which will enable you to either see that the person has the knowledge or see that the person can perform the skills. And that depends very much upon your vocational competence and current industry skills. Again, you can get someone, a colleague, to help that with that process to validate what you've done. Get someone to cross-check that you have, in fact, crossed every T and dotted every I, if you like, that what you're doing in your evidence gathering tool is a faithful reflection of the mapping, which in turn is a faithful reflection of the unit, and under those circumstances, your evidence gathering tools will be good. When you've got your evidence gathering tools, then you utilize them to gather evidence. And fundamentally, what we need to know now is, are the tools being faithfully used? So we would assume that with the tools, there will be instructions for assessors and instructions for candidates. Do these instructions for candidates and instructions for assessors make sure that quality evidence is gathered? Are these tools adequately used? And of course, we're now talking about post-use validation, but that's going to be part of the question. Well, the tools were designed and developed under standard clause 1.8. Now under clauses 1.9 through 1.11, are they being used properly to produce quality evidence? And is that evidence then mapped back to the unit requirements? That's these little ticks I put here against each of the requirements, in order for me to be able to say that the person has demonstrated all the qualities of competence or has yet not demonstrated all the qualities. If they've not demonstrated all the qualities, is there supplementary assessment that can be offered? How are you going to accommodate that? Ultimately, though, you're going to make an assessment judgment, so you can see the judgment is another box. And again, that is a very quick and straightforward process. It's simply asking the question, have I got meaningful quality evidence against all of the requirements? And does that meaningful quality evidence show that all the requirements have been demonstrated? Bingo, the person's competent, sign them off and certificate them by whatever process is involved. So you can see that this sort of process that takes us from the unit of competency out into the world of gathering evidence and back to the unit of competency to make the judgment means that we end up with a strategy for making sure that the process is a quality process. But I do want to stress that, we start from the unit of competency and we end up with the unit of competency for the judgment. But in between are numbers of different ways of getting there, because we are not defining precisely what is the specific assessment tool. And so there are lots of different assessment tools that people might devise, and we don't expect everybody to use exactly the same tool. We expect everybody to be measuring the same unit and to be making the same judgments, but the way in which you gather evidence to lead to that judgment will be different because of what we talked about in Activity 1. Different industry requirements, maybe local industry requirements, different candidate or characteristics, and different resources of the RTO. Now, a lot of people think that this variation here constitutes error. And there is a push from time to time to standardize the assessment tools and making sure everybody does the same thing. But what we understand when that happens is that we disenfranchise a lot of students because we are not being flexible enough and fair enough. In other words, we exercise flexibility and fairness, which is a principle of assessment. If we force everybody to do the same assessment, then we're no longer flexible or fair, and we've lost two of the key principles of assessment. So what we're saying here is we cannot be flexible about the unit of competency. That is fixed. That is what validity requires. Valid here in terms of the evidence gathering, valid here in terms of judgment. But we then can enjoy, I don't know if that's the right word, that flexibility and fairness when it comes to how we assess. And we're going to talk a lot more about that next week, but I do want to stress that you need to make sure that your assessment systems and processes don't close that down, that you are not trying to make everybody do things exactly the same way. You want everybody to achieve the same quality of process, but within the process itself, there is room for variability. And that variability is not necessarily error. That variability could in actual fact improve quality and improve precision and improve the fairness of the process, because what you're doing is responding to individual needs and utilizing RTO resources or even community resources in a way which enables you to get to the judgment of competence in the most efficient and effective way. And that's part of the game that we need to play, but your assessment systems and strategies need to be able to accommodate that. Don't use them as a way of shutting flexibility and innovation down. Make sure that these systems build the opportunity for it. And that's what this little chart is about. This chart is basically saying these are the points at which you make choices. These are the points at which you make decisions. But it is not saying these are the decisions you must make. And we're not saying everybody must come to the same conclusions. So we would like you to think about this pathway as that process, understanding that there are certain points which are mandated. The unit of competency is mandated. The evidence gathering tools, understanding 1.8, must meet rules of evidence. That is mandated. The judgment that you make further on must meet the principles of assessment. That is mandated. The certification, under standard 3.1, can only be done when a person's demonstrated competency through an assessment process, be it RPL or be it at the end of a training experience. That is mandated. So within this flowchart are ideas such as mapping, and you'll see mapping gets a mention twice. Those are ideas, but are not mandated. Nigel from South Metro TAFE says, why do we not have national assessments for the knowledge component? there's so much variety. I can understand the need for variety tailored to the practical component, but the knowledge, maybe not. And Nigel, I take your point entirely. I would like to share with you next time we meet, and Nigel, I hope you're going to be with us next time, so a little bit of a discussion about the function of knowledge, because one of the functions of knowledge is transfer, which means that we, in actual fact, want to welcome variety, because the same competency might be supported by different kinds of knowledge. So as soon as we standardize the knowledge, there's a potential that we are going to shut down the flexibility and transferability of the unit of competency. So Nigel, whilst I sympathise with the idea, I think we have to be very careful that we don't in a way close the unit down by being too prescriptive. So we are left with the notion in the standards, the unit of competency itself, that the function of the knowledge is to support the elements of performance criteria. That is one of the functions of knowledge. And since those elements and performance criteria might have slightly different expressions in different industries or enterprises or even states or territories or regions, then the knowledge base might be different. The other thing about knowledge, of course, is that knowledge is very transitory. The knowledge that you, if you're learning a particular skill, the knowledge will relate to perhaps a bit of equipment or a particular resource that is currently used. In 5 years' time, the knowledge may no longer be relevant, but the skill probably will be. And so weirdly, we need to be very careful that we don't become trapped by the knowledge because it represents a particular place and time. And that means we need to avoid standardizing the knowledge assessments. But I'm very happy for us to pick up on that next time we meet, because we'll be looking at the assessment of knowledge as part of the next workshop. And Nigel, hopefully we can get into your concern in a bit more detail then. But hopefully what I've just said there helps you to see that the knowledge component can have that kind of variability quite legitimately, because different circumstances, different times, different industry sectors will require a bit of variation in the knowledge. Oh, thank you, Nigel, for saying you're looking forward to it. That's nice to know that you'll be there. So now let's look at documenting our assessment system. And we have considered up till now the sort of impacts on what might be in our assessment system. We've considered the sort of steps that through that previous slide that we might need to work through in order to consider how our assessment system will need to support the kinds of decisions we need to make. And we need to consider how we're going to document the assessment system. And clearly, there's a plethora of documents illustrated by this slide. So qualification, training and assessment strategies. So you have your TAS, your training and assessment strategy document, which will in part talk about the nature of your clients and their particular needs. So cohort of students will be described, and the sorts of issues that they might have in terms of things like language literacy and numeracy, or their availability, or their remote students or local students, whatever. But also within that context, you'll obviously talk about training, which we're ignoring today, but you'll talk about assessment, but only in very broad terms, because it won't be until you get into the actual unit delivery and assessment plans. Sometimes they're called DAPs, sometimes they're called TAPs. There are various different acronyms for this, but at unit level, that's when you'll start talking with a great deal more detail about the assessment strategies that you have in mind. And of course, you'll have done a mapping, one would assume, and your unit delivery and assessment plan will be a recitation of what was decided through the mapping process. Please, if I may say as an auditor, can I ask you to make sure that your unit plans and your training and assessment strategies are consistent with each other? Because quite often we find that somebody's had a whiz-bang beaut idea in terms of assessing at a unit level and haven't communicated that back to the training and assessment strategy document, so things get a bit out of whack. And it really is important that you keep these documents consistent with each other. Then, of course, within the context of having thought about it at unit level, you will create your evidence gathering tools and mappings which show how those evidence gathering tools relate back to the unit of competency. So evidence gathering tools are usually, things like a knowledge assessment tool or a practical observation tool, something of that kind. You should have, but not always do I see it, a judgment tool. I say you should have because you need to make sure that your judgment process is planned and systematic. We'll be picking this up in the third workshop. But we do often find people are gathering really good evidence, but really don't have a strategy to manage that evidence to make a judgment. That really is important. It's the second part of competency-based assessment, making judgments. There's very little written about it. Most of the documentation is about making the assessment tool, but making the judgment tool is also important, and we should not forget that. And also reporting processes, so that when we've made a judgment, we can report on. So that can be documented. There may be information for candidates. Of course, there will be information to candidates at the beginning of each assessment tool, where the assessment's going to take place, what resources they can have, what they're expected to do, and this sort of thing. But candidates also, or the learners, need to have information well ahead of time. It's part of the fairness principle. And indeed, in the standards, in standard 5.2 and 5.1 for that matter, we are sharing information with students even before they start, so that they can understand what's expected of them from an assessment context. It's one reason why I would encourage you also to include assessment in the amount of training. It's not mandatory, it's suggested in the sheet that you might consider that. But keep in mind that assessment is a commitment of time by the student. Participating in assessment is a commitment of time by the student. So in fairness, the student needs to know that that is part of their time commitment associated with that. None of those circumstances, incorporating assessment in the amount of training is I don't want to say more honest, but more accurate in terms of telling the student this is the amount of time that you need to go to commit to this whole training enterprise, which of course does include assessment. So information to candidates is really important, particularly under the fairness requirement, so they know precisely what is expected of them. It's not going to mean that they're going to cheat. I mean, they already know what the unit of competency is. They can go to training.gov and they can read the unit of competency, and you're telling them how you're going to assess. What that is simply saying to them, if you've got the competency, you have an opportunity to demonstrate it. If you don't have the competency and I've given you the opportunity to demonstrate it, we'll find that out. That's not going to mean that they can fabricate or pretend to be competent. If your assessment tools are good quality assessment tools that are searching, then what you'll find is that the fact that they know all about what's going to happen means that you will know in truth whether or not they have those qualities of competency. And then there needs to be information for evidence gatherers. And again, that can be something that you provide to the evidence gatherers at the beginning of each assessment tool. Or it could also be general information about evidence gathering for that particular unit of competency. So again, it might talk to the evidence gatherers about resources that can be accessed by the students, the time it's going to be involved, the kinds of judgments, and I reuse judgments for the small j, the kinds of observations they need to make, and the extent to which evidence gatherers can provide guidance during the assessment process and what is prohibited in terms of guidance and so on, so that the information for evidence gatherers make sure that there's integrity in the delivery of the assessment tools that you've so carefully constructed. And so you need to think about that. And as I say, it might be a general statement about policies and procedures for evidence gathering within the RTO, and then specific information about a unit of competency, and then even more detailed and specific information about each individual assessment tool. Clearly, too, you need to have available information for appeals and for that matter, complaints. So that needs to be documented because a student who feels that in some way or other that they've been wronged needs to know that they have a right to complain about maybe an aspect of assessment or appeal against the judgment that's been made through the assessment process. Again, that needs to be documented. Your validation processes, I might say, but going back to appeals, of course, that if you provide good quality information to candidates, and then through the information of evidence gatherers so that they follow what's required, there's a very little chance of likelihood of appeal, because everything has been open in terms of what the student might reasonably expect. But nonetheless, you need to make sure that the opportunity for appeal is really there. So then we come to validation processes. And under Standard 1.9, you are required to have a systematic process for validation, and that needs to be documented, both in terms of the timing of validation and the procedure for validation, so that at the end of the process of validation, there are judgments about the validity of the tools themselves and the use of the tools, and the judgments made with those tools. And the users of those tools are validated as well, including any third parties that you might be involving in the process of evidence gathering. So you need to make sure that that is well documented as a process. So that comes up under Standard 1.9 through to 1.11, but it also touches on 1.8 because, as we mentioned in an earlier slide, each of those steps in building your assessment tools and making your assessment judgments are open to validation. Then you need to have documentation that relates to assessor credentials, and those are sometimes known as training and assessment competency matrices, TACMs, but in other RTOs they have different acronyms and different ways of doing it. But fundamentally, you need to be able to show that Standard 113, which relates to vocational competence, industry skills, and current vet skills and knowledge, are all qualities of your assessors. You need to be able to show that the assessors have met the requirements of Standard 114 and 115, because 115 relates specifically to assessment, and that 116 applies in the sense that these assessors are not just have not just achieved this some distant past, but are retaining that expertise through continuing professional development, such as coming along to a webinar, which can contribute to that. One of the reasons why Mel will be issuing you with certificates of participation, because it is evidence of 116, your continuing professional development. So you need, that all needs to be documented. The credentials of assessors need to be documented. And finally, but not in a sense embracing all of the above, are your assessment policies and procedures. And by that we're referring, of course, to the fact that the process needs to reflect upon or be reflected in a set of policies and procedures, so that these documents all carry within them appropriate information, and also carry within them a means by which you can validate that all of these components are working together harmoniously and effectively. Which takes us nicely into activity 2, which also takes us nicely into 11 o'clock, where we wanted to take our second break. I'm not too sure how this is happening, Mel, but we seem to be hitting the times reasonably well. So can I introduce to you to activity 2? Activity 2 is simply a sheet of paper, but what we're asking you to do is to think about what you would put into an assessment system policy document. And at this stage, all we're suggesting is you draft a list of headings and subheadings which would provide a comprehensive overview of your RTO's assessment systems, policies and procedures, and then copy your list to the chat box. What we're asking you to do is just to give some thought now. We're also going to take a 10-minute break. So if we convene at 10 past 11, it's now 5 to 11. If we convene at 10 past 11, what I'd like to be able to do is to share with you some of the responses from our 50 or so participants, which is a great number to have today here, on the sort of headings that you might include in a policy document. After that, we will look at validation and some of the safeguards for assessment, and that will finish us up for the day. But please keep in mind too that we're very happy for you to ask questions, as Nigel and others have done, as we go. So in the next 15 minutes, have a look at activity 2 and put up any questions that you might want us to consider, and we'll meet again at 11:10. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to get a bit of a break, but also to give some thought to the sort of headings that you might have and subheadings that you might have. And I haven't seen any come up on the screen. So what I'm going to do is to say, draw your attention to one we prepared earlier. And this is in your notes on pages 8, 9, and 10. And what you'll find on pages 8, 9, and 10 of your pre-reading notes is some of the sort of headings and subheadings that you might have in a policy document for training, for assessment, and policy and procedures. I do want to stress here, I really must stress, that this is not a prescription, but rather, as it says at the top, some ideas. TAC does not lay down what your policies and procedures might look like. Joy, thank you very much for sending us this. The course, so Joy is thinking of some headings, the course details and packaging rules. That would be very much a part of the story. It's more, that's going to be more what we would see in a training and assessment strategy document, as distinct from a generic training and assessment policies and procedures. But your policies and procedures could remind the reader that we do always need to start from the course details and packaging rules. And then Joy is suggesting you have your RTO's delivery and assessment strategy for a particular course. Again, this would be something we'd find in the TAS. So part of our assessment strategy and document could refer to the need for the TAS to talk about this. Any prerequisite required by the course, and again, our policies and procedures document may remind people to make sure that assessment of prerequisites, how can I put it, is a prerequisite to assessment of a unit of competency. So if there are any prerequisites, they must be assessed prior to the unit itself. RPL and credit transfer policy, really useful to have. Joy, I agree we need to have both, but we need to be careful that the two don't get confounded with each other, because RPL is an assessment process, whereas credit transfer is an administrative process. RPL attracts fees and is a very time-consuming process, whereas credit transfer is a very simple recognition of a statement of attainment. It does involve a little time because you need to establish the veracity of the statement of attainment, but it's relative to RPL, it's a very different process. So yes, we would want to make sure they're talked about in that. We want to talk about how the amount of training and volume of learning is calculated. And again, it's not prescribed how this is done. TAC has a fact sheet on the amount of training, we refer to it there. I might say, Joy, that we wouldn't want you to worry about volume of learning. That really is something that is required when a person's putting a course up for accreditation, because we need to see that the volume of learning is appropriate to the AQF level of the course. So a course leading to a qualification would have volume of learning calculated and reported as part of the accreditation process. But when it comes to your work as an RTO, you only need to think about the amount of training. You don't need to think about the volume of learning. That's already been done by the people who created the course and its qualification rules. Learner cohort information, how that is gathered, how that is processed, all of that would be part of the story as well. So you can see that, Joy, what you've done there is you've drawn our attention to the fact that there are significant issues that need to be addressed in our assessment system policy document. So thank you very much for that contribution. That really is valuable. If we now look at the Appendix 2 of the handout, we are now looking in effect at Activity 3, but we won't dwell on this now, because I would basically want you to take this away with you rather than for us to spend time talking about it now. But have a look at this, and what you can see is a list that has been constructed, more or less drawing on every piece of every example from every RTO that sort of has been looked at. And so it's a kind of composite list, and it's probably well and truly over the top in terms of detail. So there is a question, a reasonable question to say, do you need it all? What would you remove? And I would suggest that what you do is, you're provided with tick boxes there, is that you tick the headings and the subheadings that you think you would want to include in your RTO's policies and procedures document, and in that way you can hone in on what you feel you need as an RTO to reflect upon, and you might, in the process of reading this list and ticking the boxes that are relevant to you, discover there are some gaps. We'd love to know if there are some gaps, because we're always keen to learn. So if there's anything that's been left out of that document, that there's some ideas for a framework document, then please let us know, because that's something we could add for future workshops. We have another one, I think, from Neil. Is that Neil? And also from Joanne. So thank you very much for these. Joanne is talking about principles of assessment and rules of evidence. They are important things, required knowledge and so on, as how it's used, and evidence requirements, assessment methodologies are sort of options that are available. Thank you for that. And Neil has also talks about aim of policy. So Neil is seeing the policy document as starting off with a general statement of its aim, how it's related to legislation, which is important, particularly as there is legislation within reference to the standards for RTOs, but there's also legislation related to Disability Discrimination Act and the like, and then the purposes of assessment and the principles of assessment, and responsibility of students and assessors. All of these headings are really powerful prods to us thinking carefully about this, so that the process is not haphazard but carefully thought through. And there's another one here from Joanne. I think I've mentioned Joanne before. So thank you very much, folks, for your contribution. We'll have a look at what you've contributed there to see if you've given us a guide to something that's missing. Oh, look, in this Joanne's one, she mentions plagiarism. Indeed, that's an interesting area. How are you going to deal with issues of inauthenticity, if I can use, or authenticity? How can you ensure authenticity and the like? So there are a lot of connections. And then Joanne finishes up by talking about related legislation, related policies and related documents, because it is really important that a policy and procedure interconnects with other policies and procedures in the RTO in a cohesive way. And indeed, we went right back to our original definition. It talks about a consistent policies and procedures provide for consistency across the working of the RTO. So you want this policy and procedure not to be a standalone thing, but something that interconnects with other policies and procedures, such as staffing policies and procedures, and appeals and complaints policies and procedures, and the like. So we'll leave Activity 3, but and thank you very much for your contributions, and we would always welcome feedback on the information we've provided you in the pre-reading guide. Indeed, I think it's fair to say we would always welcome any kind of feedback you provide in relation to this workshop, partly because we have a chance on April the 9th to address any of those issues, but partly because we do run this workshop on a number of times in the year, and it would be really nice to make sure that what we're doing is up to date and current and reflects your concerns, interests and needs. So let's finish off today by looking at validation of our assessment system. So I'm just going to click here, and we need to understand that the system itself needs validation. And so we need to basically ask ourselves the question, is our assessment system doing what it needs to do? Is it making sure that we are reflecting the unit requirements? In other words, does our assessment system make sure that the unit is, well, for a start, the correct unit, because from time to time we discover people using an old version of the unit, or sometimes we find that they have used a printed version of the unit which was inaccurately copied or printed or downloaded. Everyone needs to make sure that the unit requirements are both reflective of the current unit, but also of the minutiae of the unit, if you like. We need to make sure that our assessment system and our assessments faithfully reflect the rules of evidence. So is our policy and procedure one which supports and enhances compliance with the rules of evidence? And is our system one which supports and compliance with the principles of assessment? And I use the word compliance because these three things, unit requirements, rules of evidence, and principles of assessment, are all compliance issues. So in general terms, are we complying with the standards for RTOs? And I refer you again to page 5 of the pre-reading handout, where you can see a recitation of all of the clauses and sub-clauses of the standards that relate in one way or another to assessment. And every one of these things, unit requirements, rules of evidence, principles of assessment, candidate needs, RTO resources, assessors, industry relevance, assessment validation, and RPL, all of those things, various parts of Standard 1, all things which we need to make sure our assessment system and policy service. But even then, if we look at other things like quality assurance from Standard 2, third-party assessments, and here we're talking about where we vest in a third party the responsibility for carrying out assessment, covered under 2.3 and 2.4, 2.4 particularly relating to how we monitor and validate the assessments that they're doing on our behalf. Certification is from Standard 3. The sort of information we provide to students in Standard 4 and Standard 5, how we manage appeals, where a person is disputing a judgment that was made under Standard 6. But don't forget the glossary. The glossary talks about assessment, assessment systems, assessors, competencies and units of competency, RPL and validation. The glossary is part of the standards. So you are required to comply with the glossary as well as with the clauses. And a lot of people miss that point. They seem to think the glossary is some sort of side story. It's actually part of the legislation. It's set down in legislation. Compliance with the requirements of the glossary are also consistent with your compliance obligations. And then, of course, you need to make sure that your assessment system and your assessment processes enable you to meet and learn about and respond to the expectations of industry. Now, industry does speak to you through the unit of competency, but the unit of competency is a kind of generic thing. You need to ask yourself the question, what is industry requiring of us now? What are the prospective workplaces that our graduates are going to go to? And many competencies cross across a number of different industry areas. So you need to know that what you're doing in both delivery and assessment meets and reflects the expectations of industry. And keeping in mind too that industry changes and therefore transfer is an important thing that we need to build into our assessment processes, and therefore we need to accommodate that within our policies and procedures. How do our policies and procedures make sure that you can meet the needs of candidates, both in terms of the sort of everyday needs, that in terms of availability and access and so on, to the more pressing needs of language literacy and numeracy, and to perhaps the sometimes challenging needs of disability? How can we make sure that we are fair by being flexible to make sure that the needs of candidates are respected, and responded to in an appropriate way, notwithstanding the need to make sure that we always have to make sure that industry and validation is there. And we'll be picking up on some of those points next time we meet. And finally, making the best use of RTO resources. And when we talk about RTO resources, we don't only just mean the RTO resources on campus, but also in the surrounding community. So there are workplaces which might be effective resources for assessment. If you are using workplaces as a resource, how do you manage the relationship between you as an RTO and them as an environment for assessment? And that needs to be talked about in your policies and procedures, because again, this can't be just a casual connection. If you are utilising resources outside the RTO, outside your direct responsibility and dare I use the word ownership of the RTO, then how are you going to make sure that the rights of your students and the quality of the service provided through that external process are protected? And so you might talk in your policies and procedures about how you're going to utilise non-RTO resources outside the RTO, and how you're going to make sure that they are monitored and managed in a way which guarantees quality. But to guarantee quality in our environment, we have a number of very significant facets, and we'll finish up on these because this is a way of reminding us that at the end of the day, our VET assessments stand on 4 significant pillars of quality. And this really makes VET assessment quite unique in the world of assessment. It is so unlike what happens in schools or in universities, because we have these 4 very powerful pillars upon which to stand. First of all, the assessments in the VET sector have to be done by registered training organisations. And to become a registered training organisation and to maintain registration, there has to be compliance with the standards. And these standards are not perfect, although they're jolly close to perfect in my opinion. But what they do is say these are the quality of outcomes that you need to demonstrate as an RTO. Keeping in mind, they do not tell you how to function or how to operate. They tell you what must be the outcomes of those processes. So it talks about not what information must be provided, but what qualities the information must meet. It doesn't tell you how to assess, but it tells you what quality must be achieved in the assessment process. And those are really important facets of your assessment processes. And as was suggested in the previous document put up on the screen by a colleague, things like related legislation and related policies remind us that we need to always have this in mind when we're building our policies and procedures. The second thing is we have national certification, and we have the Australian Qualifications Framework. And although the Australian Qualifications Framework only relates formally to qualifications, it nonetheless has meaning at a unit level, because what we're talking about when we talk about a unit is a level of sophistication which needs to be fixed in space. These units do not go up and down according to the cohort of students. They're fixed in space because, in terms of sophistication, because it's a reflection not of the training world, but of the work world. This is derived from industry. It is not derived from training. It is not a course from a diploma. It's a course from industry that is taught in a diploma. And we need to understand that the level of sophistication here is derived from industry, not from the qualification in which the unit is embedded. And that means that the unit of competency has an independent level of sophistication. And it might appear in a diploma, but if it is a Certificate 3 level unit, then it would be taught and assessed at Certificate 3 level. And it really is important that you understand that these are not things that move around according to your cohort of students. So national certification reminds us, firstly, that there is an absolute sense in which these are fixed in terms of sophistication. But it also reminds us that these, taken with other units, contribute to a qualification. Sometimes it's a skill set, or even just a course in, but nonetheless some outcome which is industry relevant. The third thing is that we have you as professional assessors. And look, this really makes you guys an incredibly important resource. The fact that you have these qualities makes you quite unique in the world of education. And it's because we're in the world of education and training, and because we're in the world of training, we expect you to have vocational competency. We don't expect you just to know about the stuff, we expect you to be able to do the stuff. And we expect you to understand how knowledge of different kinds contributes to the doing of this stuff. So the vocational competency is really important. We expect you to understand how this competency fits into the world of industry, how this competency ultimately leads to productive outcomes, how the decisions that you're making as an assessor when you declare a person to be competent is going to contribute to their career and to the productivity of their future workplaces and to their future development in their career. So that what you're talking about here is industry skills, or I really need to say your current industry skills, because you need to keep these sustained. And of course, you need to understand the mechanics of putting together assessment tools. And that is coming from your assessor skill set, the TAE skills in designing and developing competency-based assessments and delivering competency-based assessments and participating in validation and the like. That set of TAE courses that contribute to your understanding of the mechanics of how to take your vocational competency, your industry skills, and the units of competency and come up with a meaningful quality set of assessment tools. And finally, you have the industry standards, which is the units of competency themselves, which are basically, of course, define from time to time what is required. And unlike other forms of assessment where you have to kind of work out the standard yourself, in our world, the standard is defined for you. So as I mentioned before, it has not only a sophistication and a contribution to a qualification which is fixed, but it has characteristics within it in terms of elements of performance criteria, performance evidence and knowledge evidence, perhaps foundation skills, and maybe even other components which define for you what it is you need to build into your assessment tools. So next time we meet, we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of that. We're going to get into looking at designing and using assessment tools. And we are going to be building that all upon what we've talked about today. So you'll find that there is a coherence between the two. If you've got colleagues who are going to come to the second workshop and haven't been to the first one, get them to watch this if they can bear it, or go through at least the resources from this first workshop, because we'll be presuming to a large extent that those who are participating in the second workshop have been to the first. And there will be pre-reading for the second workshop, which will help people process. But that's on Friday, April the 9th. So I think that's the sort of last Friday of the Easter break. So I expect you all to bring chocolate eggs along for that session. We'll be looking at designing assessment tools, and we'll be taking you through the process, which we've referred to some extent today already in that part, where we start with the unit of competency and unpack it. We do a mapping of the unit of competency against potential evidence gathering tools. We revise and refine until we've come up with the sharpest, most effective way of assessing, and then we devise our knowledge assessment and our competency, our skills assessment tools to deal with that. Notwithstanding the fact that we may, in fact, from time to time discover other ways of gathering evidence. But what we need to be able to do is to assure our students that they have a way of demonstrating competency. That's part of our commitment and obligation to them. So we'll be looking at that next time, and we will then be looking in the third workshop later on in this year, looking at the way in which we use the evidence from these tools to make judgments. So there we will leave you, unless you have any questions. And if I refer you also to the fact that you can ask questions now. I'm happy to stay here and deal with questions that you might have on the screen, but also for you to know that you can go through TAC. The email address is given in that final slide, so that as often happens with a workshop, a day or two afterwards, it's a bit like getting your flu jab. A couple of days later, you get a reaction. And what this might be is a thought or an idea or a concern. Please feel comfortable about jotting an email to TAC. TAC may well pass it on to me or to someone else who has experience in the area and provide you with some feedback. So it's always understood with these workshops that quite often they raise a lot of questions at some time later, and we need to be able to make sure we use an opportunity to get a response to it. So thank you very, very much for coming along today in your various locations. I really do wish I could see you face to face. It's the sort of thing that's kind of impossible, but I'm really thrilled that so many of you have had the opportunity to give some time and some thought to these issues. I look forward to seeing you in whatever way we can at the second workshop on the 9th of April. Thank you very much.